Welcome to Library Out Loud, a conversation about any and all things related to the Spokane County Library District. Library Out Loud is brought to you by the Spokane County Library District and our friends at STCU. Now, here's your host, Jane Baker.
Hello and welcome to Library Out Loud. I'm Jane Baker with the Spokane County Library District. Joining me today is Charles Andrews, Whitworth University English professor, and we'll talk more about the World War I program that you're going to be doing with the library, and that's why you're here today. But first I want to say welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here.
Great. Before we get started, we've just met. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Midwest and did my graduate work in Chicago and lived in the Midwest all my life except for getting this job at Whitworth University, which brought me out here 11 years ago.
Wow.
And so I now have children
that are from the Northwest, but I still feel like, well, I don't know where home is, but I love it here. But Chicago is part of my heart, and anyway, I've been delighted to be an English professor at Whitworth these last 11 years.
Fabulous university, and well, I might be a little late, but welcome to the Northwest,
Thank you.
It's a good thing. So you teach English there, and we have asked you, we being the Spokane County Library District, we're commemorating the centennial of World War I this year, and you're coming to do a lecture actually, and it's Imagining Lasting Peace, British Literature, War Memorials, and Armistice Day, 1918 through 2018. So yeah, 100 years. And now I don't know if that describes anything in the title. So I'm going to ask you a few things about this. So we have the program coming up, and in the description, there's a sentence here that says, war memorials, such as London's Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey, gave the public a space to mourn, but to many it seemed like an official government response to war. Tell me about that sentence.
Yeah.
Government response to war.
Yeah. So I think it helps to back up just a little bit and to say
that throughout the war there was this incredible pressure that a lot of people felt to participate in the war effort, and as the war was showing itself to not simply be a couple of weeks and over the way that folks had initially thought.
Sure.
There were all kinds of efforts to continue to whip up the patriotism.
Among those ways of doing that, the church was very involved. Many ministers were preaching that this was God's holy war that you were to get involved with. And so there were these competing narratives that sort of emerged as many people felt that this was a disastrous war going horribly, and yet in order to keep the war in progress and to fight to a finish, a lot of narratives were very present, such as this idea that what you did was a grand sacrifice and needed to be
commemorated and held. And so once the war ends, then there's this period of what's thought of sometimes as the hangover of the war. There's about a year from 1918
to 1919. The signing of the armistice happens, and so officially the war is over, but there still is not a great sense publicly of what to do about this incredible loss of life, this incredible sense of betrayal that many people felt, that they had gone to war for something glorious, and not much there was to show for this other than these deaths. And so in 1920, there was this official move by the British government to institute some time
to commemorate and to celebrate may not be the right word, but certainly to create a public space where somehow this could be engaged. And I think in a lot of ways it's a necessary part of how nations heal and grieve. But the way that this was done, what I'll be focusing on in this talk, was the production of
some special monuments in downtown London, the cenotaph on Whitehall, and also then in Westminster Abbey, this tomb of the unknown warrior who was buried there on the 11th of November in 1920, so 2 years after the official armistice. So that's the official governmental memorialization part. And what I've been interested in is to say, how did those narratives of official memorializing, how did those come into tension or conflict with people that were saying, we don't want to remember this as a holy war. We want to remember this as a tragedy or as a catastrophe or as something that we remember because we don't want to ever do it again.
Yeah.
And so my focus has been on the art that has tried to respond in those ways.
The art, meaning the literary works?
Yeah, especially that. I will be showing images from a number of painters and other visual artists who also were trying to create memorial pieces. And the way I've kind of spun this is to say there is this more official kind of memorializing that we remember with monuments, with rolls of honor, these lists of the dead in various villages and in churches. And then there's this way that peace memorializing is held by peace activist groups, but also by many of the artists, some of whom were combatants or nurses or had been in war very directly and wanted to produce some kind of record that would help
others not want to do this again.
Yeah. Very interesting. I was recently talking with Brad Keeler and Linda Parman, who are playing the World War I music, and we were talking about the protests or the against the war, World War I, and I need to study up on my history a lot more. But I'm very familiar with the Vietnam War and how people felt after that, and maybe because it's more recent. But I had to really think back to that happened with World War I, and the Spanish American War, and those. So how did you find this? What led you to this?
Yeah. So, as you said, I'm an English professor, and my area is early 20th century British. So when I'm teaching my regular English classes, I'm focusing a lot on novels and poetry from the 1920s and 30s. But I come at it with a strong interest in peace studies. And so one of my efforts has been to try to get us to think about the ways that literary studies and peace studies can be brought more closely together. My interest, as I said, has long been in that kind of World War I and 1920s era. My book project, however, I discovered in doing the research that that was really the 1930s in England where the peace movement becomes its biggest. There was such a widespread sense that they didn't want another war to happen, as we know. That occurs.
Yes.
But the peace movement is at its height, really, in the 30s. And so my book project looked at novelists in the 1930s who were people who had experienced, in most cases, World War I and were trying desperately to prevent this next war from coming as they can feel it underway. The work that I've been into for a new book project has been to say, well, let's go back and look at a set of constituents who were part of the war. We all think about soldiers who, of course, were in combat, and there's a wealth of writing, usually from the late 20s. There's about a 10-year lag time in many cases before fiction starts being written in Britain. You think about even in other places, like All Quiet on the Western Front is a novel of the late 20s. And so you have this kind of wave of what are called war books, these novels and memoirs that come out when the public is kind of ready to handle them by combatants. What's been newly kind of on the horizon, many scholars have turned to seeing how many nurses were involved. We tend to think of World War I as a male war. It's all the men in the trenches, right?
Sure.
And the new kind of hot area of study has been to say, well, women were at the front lines in just as many numbers. Well, maybe not numerically, but certainly as close and as upfront with the violence as these male combatants. The nurses were these central presences, and there's all kinds of nurses' memoirs and novels that were written by women who'd gone through these things that have been less often talked about, but are kind of a surge in interest. I've also then been looking at
journalists, which is an area that I think we forget about as well. They're on the front lines, the 5 official journalists especially, and then chaplains who were there, who had gone through the combat training but were serving as chaplains. So those 4 constituencies
are what I've been looking at, and have found that in many cases those folks experienced war and then tried to write memoirs, poetry, sometimes plays, often novels, that would communicate the experience of their bodies having gone through something that this next generation, they were afraid, who didn't have this experience, would not be able to comprehend, and therefore might get swept up in these same kinds of patriotic, religious, nationalistic ideologies that they felt had led to this really unnecessary First World War.
Oh, fascinating to hear about like you said, the nurses and things. Yeah, very interesting. So, what? Well, do you have names of people of books?
Yes. So part of my talk, I figured it's a library talk, and so one of the things I do have is a handout that's a bibliography and for a lifetime of reading. And so among those that I'll directly mention, almost any time I'm doing anything, I talk about Virginia Woolf. I absolutely love Virginia Woolf, and she, of course, was not a combatant, was not on the front lines in any nursing capacity, but her novel Mrs. Dalloway is just one of the fabulous immediate post-war novels, and has scenes in that novel of young men in uniform going past the cenotaph, this monument right in central London, and laying wreaths. So she is not setting the novel on Armistice Day, but she's showing how regular commemoration of the war is present. And she does this to sort of show that even when you think you've moved into civilian life, the pressures of that militaristic vision that had been present for all those 4 years has not gone away. And Woolf at that time is very anxious that this is coming. And as she ages, and as many writers did, becomes more and more overt about what she says about the coming war as she writes in the 30s. So Virginia Woolf would be among them. When we look at those people who had first-hand experience, Siegfried Sassoon is someone I've spent a lot of time working on. He's known often as a war poet. He was a apparently very skilled killer in war, and then had a crisis of conscience in 1917 and wrote a letter. He was a commanding officer. He wrote a letter declaring himself finished with the war, and he delivered it to his office and left. And the British government didn't know what to do with a decorated war hero who now says the war should stop. They were worried that this was going to be too powerful of a protest, so they declared him insane and said he had a pacifist disorder, and sent him to a mental hospital where they were going to let him just kind of languish out. So they weren't going to court-martial him, which they thought would have given too much attention. Instead, send him to a hospital, call him insane, and just let him kind of ride this out. He ultimately ends up going back and writing beautifully about this whole scenario.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, your lecture is going to be fascinating too. I can't wait to hear more about that. I do want to take a moment here before we take a break to let people know that Casey Andrews will be speaking at Cheney Sunday, November 4th. That's this Sunday, from 3 to 4 p.m. That's where the lecture will happen. And then again at Spokane Valley Library on Thursday, November 29th, from 7 to 8 p.m. Both events are free of charge. And great topic. We're going to talk more with you, Casey, when we come back. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back on Library Out Loud.
Hi, I'm Larry Myers, owner of River Ridge Hardware. Welcome to our garden center here on the corner of Garland and Driscoll. We have fresh plants that come in weekly from all of our local growers. We can make your garden look like our garden. Here at River Ridge, we've been here 30 years. We're your full-service neighborhood hardware store. This is our sprinkler aisle, where my knowledgeable staff will help you put together your sprinkler system so it will make your yard lush green for the spring and summer. This is River Ridge Hardware's rental center, where we provide a multitude of equipment for rent for the do-it-yourselfer. Next time you're working on your home or yard this spring and summer, stop by, say hi, and we'll help you get the project done.
See you tomorrow night, and thanks again for taking care of the painting.
I got this.
Bye.
Weekends are made for painting. Let the experts at Rada Paint take care of you.
Hi. This looks amazing.
Rada Paint, over 80 years of quality, tradition, and trust. Find it in every can.
Hello there, Internet. My name is Braden Magruder, and I'm just coming out of the Spokane Talks building, and I'm excited to bring to you guys a new announcement that I am going to be the new host of the Youth Spotlight program. Now, our old host, Colin, he's off to Texas Christian University to pursue a degree in theater and broadcasting, and you know what? That's great for him, but that's what I like to call adulting. And you know, I don't think that we have time for adulting with the Youth Spotlight program. What the Youth Spotlight program is here to do is to bring to you guys news, the greatest news of some of the most amazing people here throughout Spokane that are, just going in high school, maybe about to go into college, you know. These people are achieving life's dreams and they are so young. And I think that these are stories that you guys should know about. And I'm so excited to be bringing them to you. Now, I'm a Spokane native myself. I've been performing throughout Spokane in various different shows. I just closed the show of Music Man, and you know, I guess I like long walks on the beach, keeping my business attire, while also keeping my French fry socks on close at hand. You know, it's going to be a great year, and I'm so excited to be your guys' host. So tune into Youth Spotlight to watch me interview some of the most amazing people. Thank you and have a great day.
Welcome back to Library Out Loud. Jane Baker here with the Spokane County Library District. I'm talking with Casey Andrews, English professor from Whitworth University. Thank you again for coming down and joining me today.
So great.
We're commemorating World War I in a program that's happening in November here at our libraries, and you're giving a couple of lectures, one lecture at a couple different places, and we're talking about peace studies and British literature and fascinating stuff that we've been discussing. In the first half of this program, you mentioned a book project. I have to ask you more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first academic monograph, solo-authored book came out last year. It's called Writing Against War, Literature, Activism, and the British Peace Movement. And so I was mentioning in the first half a little about that. It looks at 5 writers who were all connected with the largest secular pacifist organization called the Peace Pledge Union, which was formed in the 1930s. And all of these writers were deeply involved with activism and were also trying to write high art literary fiction that was anti-war, but that would not turn into propaganda. And this is this challenge that I found that all these writers were struggling with. They all wanted to write books that would be perceived as real, full-fledged novels, not just sort of tracts. But how to do that was a task that they found a big struggle and found different ways through. And intriguingly, none of those 5, even though they knew each other, even though they were in the same anti-fascist, anti-war organizations, seemed unaware that they were sharing this same intellectual problem.
Oh, wow.
The most famous of them would be Virginia Woolf and Aldous Huxley, who were having dinner together in each other's homes,
talking politics. You knew that they were writing fiction, and you read Woolf's diary, and she would say, "I have a horror of writing an Aldous novel. That must be avoided." So she thought that she was up to something completely different.
What exactly he was working on. So it's a book that's about the 30s, but I see it as also having some insights for today about those of us who care about having politics be central to our art, but not wanting the political message to kind of dampen or diminish the quality of the artwork. I think this is something my poet friends tell me they still struggle with today.
Wow. Yes. Yeah, I could see that. So that's a book you've already written, or you're working on?
Yeah, so that one came out in 2017 by Northwestern University Press in a series that they have on World War II. And then I have a couple of projects that are underway, and you know, it's always a thing. Academic publishing is slow, and who knows how long this will take to do this. But the one project is related to these 4 constituencies: the soldiers, nurses, chaplains, and journalists who went through the war, at first excited to go to war, and then wrote anti-war works in the 20s and 30s in response to those experiences. So that one is one project underway, and the other one that I'm working on is more in response to the issue of these memorials that I'll be talking about with this library talk. It's looking at the tension that I see between civil religion, so the ways that, as I said, the church would sort of engage with the state to sort of bless state institutions. Many of the writers I was looking at in the 20s were very disturbed. They were not people of faith. They found this to be very disturbing and found this kind of combination to be the worst version of what they perceived as a church-state relationship. And so looking at writers that I think were kind of writing alternative theologies. These are novelists, but they're still trying to engage with this problem of how state institutions get kind of swept up and intermixed with these things like Christian faith. And the downside of this is that what it can do is it convinces people to go to a needless war like World War I. It makes it seem like it's has ultimate stakes, and so I'm interested in the writers that tried to think of alternatives to that.
Absolutely fascinating. So these people were going into war, not unlike today, thinking they're doing the right thing and being patriotic and loyal. I think loyalty was a big thing. And then after the experience, they come back, and they didn't call it PTSD. But I'm using that. I'm throwing that in here. But is that kind of what it was?
Yeah. So for the soldiers, and a lot of the best work today, I think, says that World War I was the war that reshaped many aspects of our globe, our politics, even our religious constructions, and the world we live in today has inherited what happened in 1918. There's a great book by Philip Jenkins called The Great and Holy War, and he basically says if you look at the current construction of global Islam, that it comes out of some of the things that even happened at the end of World War I. We don't think about those things in the global reach of this European war, but so PTSD is a term we have today. At the time they called shell shock, and they thought that it was actually a concussion from the bombs that actually was hitting people's nerves, and the reason they were feeling sick when they would come out of war is that their nerves were actually jangling. They thought this was what was going on, and then there was some gradual turns to kind of understand and differently medicalize that. For the writers I look at, I think what's so interesting is for many of them, Siegfried Sassoon, who I mentioned, thought very much about his writing as a form of therapy. He was not getting, at his mental hospital where he was forced, he was not getting a lot of treatment that he was finding helpful. It was mostly he felt being conditioned to feel differently about the war. But what he found meaningful was writing poetry at the time and sharing his poetry with others. He met the great poet Wilfred Owen in that same hospital, and so the two great war poets of that war were together in the same hospital exchanging drafts of poems. Owen is killed about a week before the war ends, and Sassoon lives until the 1960s and continues to write and continue to be tormented by World War I, even though he ultimately is very patriotically in support of World War II and writes poetry in that way. In the 50s and 60s, he writes in these ways, still questioning the world that he has inherited and the one he participated in, and still seeing his writing as a form of working through PTSD or other sorts of mental illness that has come from this horrific experience he went through.
Wow. Fascinating. So now, do you talk about more than just literature, though? How about any artwork or?
In the talk especially, I do have some visual art. There was an artist called Arthur Ragg, W-R-A-G-G. He was a young British man who got very involved with kind of the peace movement and has these very stark etchings that I'll show, some of which take the memorials, the monuments that were being constructed, and he refashions them. There's one amazing one that I love to show that has the cenotaph, which has the famous words on it, "The glorious dead," and on the cenotaph he has inscribed this image of a combatant, a Tommy, who looks as though he's being crucified on this, and it's this way of combining this and saying, this is the sacrifice, this is what we've done to our young men. It's very powerful.
Wow. Yeah. So at the lecture that you're doing for the libraries, there's a visual. I mean, what can people expect?
Yeah, so I like to have a lot of slides with very little text, so it's not a bullet pointy kind of thing, but I love to show lots of images. Yeah, so you'll see images of central London and some of the monuments. I have some of the archival footage that was taken while the unknown warrior was being buried, and so we'll see some images of that video, and then I put up kind of quotes and images and book recommendations as I kind of use some of the archival research I've done. And then the conclusion of the talk is, so I say, 1918 to 2018. Currently, there's a lot of work going on in England, especially, and France and other of the combatant nations to commemorate right now. So I have some reflections on just the range of things that are being done. I have been looking into, apparently on November 11th, Danny Boyle, the famous filmmaker who's made Slumdog Millionaire, and he did the Olympics. He's been asked to do this beach landing where they're drawing on the sand the faces of Wilfred Owen and other of these combatants and letting the water wash over them. And this is going to be filmed and broadcast live. So there's all kinds of commemorative acts that are happening right now. And there are people who are still saying, are we commemorating in ways that are just actually celebrating? Are they saying this was all good, rather than mourning this, rather than working to think about this lasting peace that I use in this title?
This is fascinating. It sounds like your lecture, certainly a not to miss one. And yeah, I'd like to get the list of further books to read.
Absolutely.
Because now my interest is piqued, and I'd like to learn more. One more time, Casey Andrews will be speaking at the Cheney Library on Sunday, November 4th from 3 to 4 p.m. And again at the Spokane Valley Library on Thursday, November 29th from 7 until 8 p.m. Both are free of charge, so come by and hear this lecture, see these great slides that you have, and this knowledge, and learn more. It sounds like a fascinating program. So I'm very thrilled to have you come to the library, thrilled to have you on the program, thrilled to meet you, and I hope we have you come back and talk about this again soon. So
I'd like that very much. Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you, and once again, welcome to the Northwest.
Thank you.
All right, for Library Out Loud, I'm Jane Baker. We'll see you next time.
Library Out Loud is produced in Spokane, Washington by SpokaneTalksOnline.com, which is solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, and hear this program again online anytime at SpokaneTalksOnline.com. Library Out Loud is brought to you by the Spokane County Library District and STCU. Go visit and explore your local library today.